As developers in cities everywhere tear down the old to build the new, we often forget that lying just beneath the surface are reminders of our past. In the city of Leeds, England, a developer came across a chilling discovery from the past when they were clearing land to build a series of new residential homes. The grim find gives insight into the city's history and just how different life was back then, making those who found it glad for modern conveniences. Hundreds of bottles containing a toxic drink were uncovered in England. Leeds is one of the UK's fastest growing urban areas, and also one of the oldest. Structures in the northern city date back to the 13th century, when it was known as Lloydies, and signs of that old-fashioned charm are still around. With so much history, it's no surprise that there would be artifacts from other eras hidden just below the surface. In 2020, one developer was clearing land to put in new homes, until he received word of an immediate halt of construction. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with the construction crew or the machinery. No, they'd found something strange collecting dirt down there. Without any obvious explanation, the developer called in the experts. According to a report in the Yorkshire Evening Post, English Archaeological Services company WIAS began investigating a stash of old bottles that was found underground. Even more interesting were that the bottles had liquid inside them. David Williams, the senior project manager for WIAS, told reporters that a variety of brands were identified, but most of the bottles featured the label J. E. Richardson of Leeds, dating the bottling back to somewhere in the 1880s. The liquid inside the unopened bottles were first thought to be ginger beer, as it were a popular drink in that era of Victorian England, considered to be exotic and good for the health. So, samples were sent to nearby West Yorkshire Joint Services for a proper analysis. When the results came back, they actually confirmed that it wasn't ginger beer, but regular ale. This made sense given the location, which according to records, was the site of the now long-gone Scarborough Castle Inn. The label on the bottles also confirmed that they were, without doubt, brewed by the brand Joshua Tetley & Son, which, to any drinkers of English beer, should sound familiar to this day. The beer was some of the earliest batches ever found of Tetley's ale. The Tetley's Beer Brewery was founded by Joshua Tetley and his son, Francis William, in 1822 in Leeds. By 1860, Tetley was the largest brewery in the north of England, with annual beer production hitting as high as 171,500 barrels by 1875. The archaeologists who discovered the stashed-away ale were excited to come across such an early batch of the famous beer that was synonymous with Leeds, and were considering cracking open a bottle to try it. However, the results from the lab analysis quickly killed that idea. The lab determined that the beer was toxic, as it was absolutely packed full of lead. The World Health Organization says that the maximum acceptable amount of lead to be in any substance for consumption is 0.01 milligrams per liter. These bottles measured 0.13 milligrams per liter. The scary thing about all this is that this is probably what people were used to consuming at the time. You see, the lead count was so high because of what the water and fluids came in contact with during the brewing process. Lead was one of the most commonly used materials to make pipes at the time, but people weren't aware of the danger it posed. Over time, flakes from the lead would make their way into the liquid, ultimately ending up in the water and into the bodies of the people who drank it. Humans have mined lead for thousands of years, dating back to the Bronze Age. The material is easy to shape and abundant, making it a practical choice for construction. However, there is also evidence that we knew of its poisonous nature during most of that time. Humans have mined lead for thousands of years, dating back to the Bronze Age. The material is easy to shape and abundant, making it a practical choice for construction. However, there is also evidence that we knew of its poisonous nature during most of that time. The Greek philosopher Nicander of Colophon reported on sickness from lead poisoning as early as 250 BCE, and later, during the Roman era, gout was prevalent among the upper classes of society as a result of the enormous lead intake from contaminated foods and wine. Yet we continued to mine and produce objects out of the metal for centuries. The problem was that the effects were often not immediate, and with a less sophisticated understanding of medicine, the problems from lead were often attributed to other things. So what would happen if someone drank some of the poison Tetleys? Well, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, warns that the effects of lead consumption depend on your age and overall health. In children, it's linked with learning difficulties and lowered IQs. In adults, lead poisoning leads to cardiovascular problems, weakened kidneys, and issues with fertility in both women and men. Pregnant women are particularly vulnerable as the toxic metal can negatively affect the fetus. This information suddenly made the Leeds bottles seem far less refreshing. Drinking one or two probably may not have led to long-term health issues, but in the Victorian era, large portions of the population were consuming lead in small amounts over a long period of time, leading to health issues that were difficult to isolate and diagnose. Eventually, as city infrastructure modernized and lead started to go away in favor of steel, health problems that were directly attributed to lead fell as well. But the discovery of the Tetleys showed just how dangerous everyday life was in eras past. The 100-year-old beer is now on display at the site of the former Tetleys brewery as part of Leeds' heritage and a window into the past of Victorian England. Kinda makes you want to crack open a cold one, lead-free, of course. Many experts compared this find to a development just a hop across the Irish Sea. A turf cutter from Northern Ireland called Jack Conway went out to work on the Imlac Bog. At first, all looked normal, but he was about to unearth something that hadn't seen the light of day for thousands of years. While he was working, Jack's shovel suddenly hit something quite a bit harder than the peat he was trying to harvest. He quickly dug it up, especially since it would hardly be the first time that something mysterious was unearthed from the bogs before. You see, the land that became the bogs was once the intersection of three different ancient kingdoms and was thought be a place with supernatural powers, almost like something out of a high fantasy movie. The land's mystical reputation would bring people in droves to the bogs. Feeling a spiritual connection to the land, people would often come and bury offerings to the gods for their protection. Such sacrifices weren't meant to be dug up again, but the bogs actually do have a special property people discovered centuries later. The low temperatures and high acidity of the bogs, combined with a low amount of oxygen, makes them excellent at preserving whatever is buried below. Over time, people have uncovered a veritable treasure trove's worth of artifacts from Irish peat bogs. Because the bogs prevent decomposition, old objects including tools, coins, jewelry and other thousand-year-old curios have been found in relatively good condition. The preservative properties of the bogs also made them useful for a more sinister purpose, which made Jack's initial discovery a bit worrisome. The marshy depths of the Imlac Bog were also particularly good at mummifying bodies. Several ancient corpses were found on the bottom of the bog, some very clearly not there by accident either. Thankfully, it became clear Jack hadn't found a body, but he still wasn't sure what he had found either. In fact, it just looked like a large, oddly shaped rock. However, there was one thing that stood out about Jack's discovery: it had a particularly odd smell to it, described as being similar to a strong but not unpleasant cheese. Unable to make any sense of the chunk buried 12 feet into the bog, Jack called in the officials from the Cavan County Museum. After properly examining it and even going as far as carbon dating the object, they finally revealed what Jack had found. It was actually butter, 2,000-year-old butter to be precise. Funnily enough, the butter had been so well preserved that it was still technically edible. But what on earth was it doing in the middle of a bog? Unlike modern bricks of salted butter that can keep fresh for a few months without a refrigerator, salt wasn't common in medieval Ireland. So the low temperatures and preservative properties of the bogs made them into a natural freezer of sorts. Hundreds of lumps of this hard butter have been discovered in containers made of animal bladders or wood, many of which also survived for thousands of years in pristine condition. But why would ancient people go through so much trouble just for a condiment? Back in medieval times, butter was actually a luxury good that people could pay their taxes and rent with. While we wish we could pay our bills with Land O'Lakes like that, there's still one important question about this ancient butter: how does it taste? First, we should probably start with the smell. While Jack described the lump he unearthed as having a fairly pleasant scent, other people were less charitable. The smell of ancient bog butter has been compared to a stomach-churning combination of spoiled milk and bad Parmesan cheese. Who would be brave enough to try tasting this then? Andrew Zimmern actually tried a bit of 3,000-year-old bog butter on his show Bizarre Foods. He described the taste as a lot of funk with a crazy moldy finish. But there are still people who can't resist trying it for themselves. A 300-year-old lump was actually brought into an Irish elementary school for the kids to taste test it for themselves. Funnily enough, they claimed it wasn't too bad. Perhaps it's more of an acquired taste. Either way, this ancient tradition is starting to catch on with locals. In fact, one local man decided he would create his own bog butter. After making 3 pounds of homemade butter, Brian Collar wrapped it in cheesecloth and buried the lump in the bog behind his house. He'd dig it up after a year of aging in the Irish countryside. The end result looks considerably more appetizing than any of the ancient ones that were unearthed. According to Brian, it has an earthy flavor that he enjoys when making eggs or drizzling it on top of popcorn. He even invited his neighbors to share it. Though the trend of DIY bog butter probably won't catch on, many hunks continue to be discovered. You can even view a few pieces in Irish museums, just don't be surprised if they won't let you have a taste. Though these aren't the strangest places where old foodstuffs were uncovered. After sinking in a maritime battle in 1676, the Goliath ship the Cronin sat peacefully at the bottom of the ocean for 300 years. Amazingly, in 1980, an amateur researcher named Anders Fransson discovered the shipwreck's location. The Swedish government sponsored yearly archaeological dives to collect any lost artifacts. What was hidden in the ship for all that time? After a thorough search of the ship, the dive teams found a bunch of old firearms, though that was just the beginning. They also found musical instruments, including violins and trumpets, an abundance of gold and silver coins, a gold ring, and a wooden plaque with the name of the ship carved into it. Still, one particular find surpassed all the others. Just when researchers thought they unearthed nearly everything of importance, one of them came across this black tin jar nestled in the mud, and it was heavy. At first, nobody had any idea what they had stumbled across. More gold and silver coins, perhaps. When scientists finally pried open the can, an overwhelming pungent smell hit them like a putrid wall. It was almost too much to bear. They stared at the grayish lump of mush and suddenly it hit them. It was some kind of preserved cheese product. They described the smell as a mix of yeast and Roquefort cheese. During the era when the Cronin was built, cheese was a real status symbol. It separated the rich from the poor. In this case, however, the cheese was well past its prime. The Cronin cheese sits on display at the museum along with the rest of the findings. Since the ship was discovered in 1980, diving teams have collected over 30,000 artifacts, and they haven't even explored every nook and cranny. Maybe they'll come across a nice Merlot to pair with the cheese.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.